Hi, I'm Jay Hirsch, Director of Administration of Columbia's ERM program. I'd like to welcome you to today's event, Managing the Risks and Fallout from Russia's Invasion of Ukraine. And now I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Steve Lindo. Steve?
Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webcast. I'd like to, first of all, just tell you a couple of things about myself, and then also allow my co-presenter, Jay Grusin, to introduce himself. I'm not going to go through all the details. A few years in the industry and some educational background really are my specialties. The things that I think might help you to understand why this is a topic that's so important from my point of view are that during this career of mine, I can count at least 5 crises that I've lived through in one way or another, working in risk management. And on top of that, I can now add a pandemic. So there's a lot of uncertainty in those histories that I think are relevant to the situation we're going to talk about today. The other thing I think that's worth mentioning is a long period of my career was spent working in developing countries. So I think that for many of you trying to deal with the impact of this strange situation, developing countries are something that's maybe jumped onto your radar screen that weren't before. And then lastly, I worked a long time during this career on trade finance, and international trade, as you'll see in the coming slides, is going to be a big component of some of the issues that Jay and I will be talking about. But without further ado, let me also then hand over the mic and let my co-presenter Jay Grusin introduce himself.
Good morning. My name is Jay Grusin. 3 things to keep in mind about me as we go through this. Number 1, this month marks my 42nd year as an intelligence analyst, 30 years in the Central Intelligence Agency, and the subsequent 12 as a contractor teaching analysts all over the country. Number 2, I helped to build intelligent analysis in the mid-90s when the Central Intelligence had no real training programs for analysts, and it's grown into a large, globally expanding program. Number 3, Steve and I have a unique collaboration that you'll see woven into this. There's my world and there's Steve's world. My world of intelligence and Steve's in commerce. And for the first time, what we have done is we have blended the 2 worlds. So basically what I did for 29 years, now 42 years in the business, is now hanging in Steve's world as well. And it was a marvelous, if not always easy, collaboration. And with that, off we go.
So what we have in mind for you today is a combination of some talking by ourselves, but also some collaboration and contributions from yourselves. So there will be some live polls. So we'll tell you when. Get ready to wield your mouse because we'd like to hear from you several times during today's webcast. What we're going to do is we're going to frame the topic a little bit, talking about the nature of the situation, the nature of how companies, organizations of all kinds have to deal with the decisions relating to this unusual and fast-moving situation. And then we're going to go into the mechanics of the methods that Jay specialized in throughout his career and which we put together in a form that can be used by all of you in your respective works. And then just when you think that that's enough, we're then going to take you into a case example. Basically, we've constructed a case that will describe how, in a certain circumstance, a simulation, if you will, how you can apply this method step by step to come up with an assessment that really will help your company make the right decisions. So that's a lot to get done in a short space of time. So let's jump right in with this. So first of all, I don't think I have to elaborate on this too much, but the situation that's going on with the unprovoked invasion by Russia of Ukraine brings an entire radius of uncertainty to many of what you might call routine areas, risks that you would typically be managing in a somewhat predictable or historically constrained way, suddenly can get broken apart. As we know from previous crises, going back in at least our memories, the way that the various layers of business are connected today is vastly more complex than it ever was in previous history. So there are domino effects and ramifications that previously were contained. Now they have a tendency to percolate throughout the entire strata of the industry, the financial markets, commercial markets, goods and supplies, and so on, as we'll talk about. The third important point is that whilst it might seem that for many of you dealing with the most urgent and relevant issues for your organizations today, this week, next week, there are some long-term consequences, some tectonic changes, so to speak, in the way that the world business and politics operate that are going to be affected by the situation, the dynamic situation in Ukraine. And even though we can't necessarily predict with accuracy what those impacts will be, it's really important to remember that the long-term risks will be impacted by decisions that you make today and tomorrow. Excuse me. And the last point is that you might think that perhaps if you're located in one geography, if you're in the Americas, or if you're in Asia, or somewhat remote from the actual the front where fighting is going on, that somehow you might be immune from any of the consequences. And we're going to argue that you're not. It might just be, though, that the consequences that impact you and your business might not be the ones that are immediately visible, and certainly maybe not the ones that are being profiled in the news. So we're going to start out now by getting you to join us in a poll. Basically, what we're going to ask you to do, and I'll launch the poll momentarily, is just to tell us from your unique perspective, well, in whatever category you're in, tell us which you think are the top 2 of these 6 risks that are part of the what we believe to be the compendium of risks facing companies as a result of this situation. And we'll just see, we'll all see together to what extent you as our audience today, how your opinions about these types of risks are distributed. So we'll give you about 30 seconds to answer the poll. Please do so as quickly as you can. But in the meantime, the reason for introducing this poll so early in our presentation is to try to get you to engage in the whole idea that this is not just an academic topic, that we're not talking about something that's going on somewhere else, that's happening to somebody else. Inherently, this is happening to everybody. And our way of attempting to measure that, even though it's only a brief measure and it's only with today's audience, is to find out from your responses what kind of profile you represent in terms of this compendium of risks that have been generated by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So it looks like we've got just a few of you have been able to answer the poll question. But I think in the interest of time, what we're going to do is we're going to move on. So I'm going to end the poll now, and I'm going to share the results so everybody can see. So what you can see, therefore, is that we have kind of a concentration in the supply chain and the spikes in energy. What we really have is approximately 40, I guess, 60 or so % of you really pick those as your 2. We have some showing in all the other ones, which is interesting from our point of view, because it means that there amongst you, our participants today, everyone has some, at least residual portion of every one of the 6 risks that we're showing. So from my point of view, I think this is sort of what I expected. Jay, did you have any expectations about this poll, but really the supply chain and spikes?
What strikes me really quickly, real quickly, what strikes me is that there is a range. Yes, it's concentrated in the 2nd and 3rd, but there's a range. And for each one of you who answered this is your issue. And the issue can change tomorrow or the next week. And so it's important to see that even though the number of you who responded to some of the other issues are they're critical to you. And I invite you to pay attention today as we walk through this to see how we can work through your issue. That's it, done.
Great, thanks so much. All right, so what we're now thinking is that we gave you 6 risks that we thought probably were the ones that would be sort of in the bullseye and the inner ring of your perception of what might go wrong as a result of this situation. But we also want to remind you that there are some other risks, and these are ones which we'll actually will be identifying as we go through the methodology later in today's webinar. Things that might not necessarily be top of your list of priorities, but which you know to be latent in the kind of situation that we have, in particular things like cyber attacks, which are already, for many of you, somewhat of a high priority, but a difficult risk to manage because of the nature and unpredictability of it. And then lastly, but extremely importantly, the whole issue of reputational damage. So reputational damage could be something that you do either consciously or unconsciously, or your organization might be completely inadvertently caught in the backwash of a situation in which somehow, quite reasonably, your organization had been involved and didn't have any inkling that potentially some of the fallout from this Russia-Ukraine situation might come back later on to harm you. So we'll definitely also touch heavily on reputational risk as we go through our examination. Okay, so before we get into the methodology, just one thing I want to kind of use to tee up why this methodology is somewhat additional to the way that you and your colleagues typically deal with the day-to-day decisions. So the main issue that is pervasive across all layers of the industry is that these kinds of situations like Russia, Ukraine, they don't happen every day. They happen once in a blue moon. Perhaps we might wish they don't happen, but they do. And when they do, there isn't necessarily a well-oiled process to be able to examine and take tactical and strategic decisions based on situations that are fast-moving and very uncertain. And I think the pandemic would be something that's fresh in your minds because not many organizations had a game plan for the pandemic before it happened. It was something that had to be built as the situation evolved. So the way that we like to think about the distinction between the routine day-to-day decisions, these are things where you have kind of a well-structured, well-rehearsed plan. You take decisions fast. If you need to, you can change or reverse them. And it's kind of a group activity. The top leaders of your company get together, they decide, a decision gets implemented, and you move on to the next one. Over on the right-hand side, however, of the slide, the crisis decisions, like ones involving the situations with a great deal of complexity and uncertainty, that certainly would be a good way to attribute to the Russia-Ukraine situation. Conflicting and incomplete data, because of those preemptive situations, in the room that's attempting to assess and make decisions, you have somewhat of a melee of opinions and emotions. You have individuals' biases, you have the politics of the organization, you have some have more influence than others. Basically, what you have is a very, very dynamic and potentially complicated situation that needs to be managed in a manner that would allow the best and the most coherent knowledge in that room to be properly applied to the situation. And so that's what we're going to spend the bulk of today's webcast is basically showing you a way to be able to deal with these crisis situations in a structured and a very organized fashion. So I'm going to hand over the mic now to Jay, because Jay will introduce what you need to know about our methodology for the purposes of today's webinar, which of course, as we have mentioned before, is predicated on his decades of experience in the intelligence world. Jay, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Steve. What I want to do is provide some context around the bullets that you see on the screen. I lived in a world under intense pressure, and you live in a world under intense pressure. And where that pressure coming from can change from the morning to the afternoon, and certainly from day to day, as Steve pointed out. And intelligence analysis is the process that we use inside the intelligence community to sort all this out. If Steve really talked about the why, intelligent analysis is really about the how. It's the mechanics of getting from where you are to a judgment. And we call this judgment actionable intelligence. In other words, you're going to be providing someone, an audience, a decision maker, with the information and analysis they need to be successful, to make that decision to reach their desired state. The goal is to provide them with unbiased, objective, evidence-based analysis with a clear assessment of the likelihood, the estimated probability of reaching that desired state, delivered in a clear message. It's a lot, but it's what we had to do every day. It's the key here to keep in mind is that this is a collaborative process. And again, the goal here is not to change how you make the decision. We only want to test the decision itself. That's it. Before you hit that send button, we want you to test the estimated probability that your audience will reach a desired state that they want to reach. And again, collaboration is critical. You imagine yourself in a room with 12 people who disagree. How do you get there? And this is really the outline of the process. And the first box is really one of the most critical. It's really know who your audience is and their requirements. What do they need? Who is your audience? It's not everyone, all right? It's who you're writing for. Who needs to act on the analysis that you provide? Who's the action officer? And so you have to, once you decide that and you develop the key intelligence question, you'll be able then to sort through all the data. If you think about the data that you have to draw on, it's a tsunami. If you know who you're writing for and what question they need answered that day, then you can begin to collect and array the data that's targeted. And after that, we go into the process of sorting through the assumptions that you're making that are underpinning the judgment that you're making. So we're going to walk you through the steps, and you can see that the steps take us all the way through the refined assignment. Again, this is the collaborative process. It's about creating actionable intelligence for the audience. Okay, Steve?
Yeah, so bear those 5 boxes in mind. And so what we're going to do, as I mentioned at the beginning, is so rather than talk in theoretical terms about that 5-step process, we're actually going to perform that 5-step process with you as our partners here. And we're going to get you to help us a couple of times along the way. So in order to be able to apply this method to something that seems realistic, basically, we put together a synthetic company. We are using the company's principal line of business as agriculture, in part because that's very relevant to the Russia-Ukraine situation with the huge quantities of Ukrainian grain that are trapped and the disruption to the world grain markets because of the conflict in that part of the world. So our theoretical company is Vanderbilt. It has businesses across the entire chain of food ingredients of every different kind. And so we're not just saying it's not just grain, but there's all kinds of different elements of the food business that could be affected by the disruption of normal commerce and the interference in supply chains in Ukraine. So thinking back to the various different types of risks, the ones that you answered in the poll, plus the ones that I added, what we've really got here is that we have kind of like what you might call a dead hit of all of those risks on our simulated company. So on Vanderbilt, they have physical properties, supply chains, they have their receivables, the companies they've sold to that need to pay, energy, raw material, employees, insurance, their financial assets in the various geographies that are affected by the conflict, information security, and then lastly, but not all to be ignored, they also have the reputational risk of their existing business having touch points with both Russia and Ukraine in many different lines of business. So we think they're a good proxy for the kind of situation that you and potentially your organization would be involved in. So for the next few minutes, imagine yourselves as being involved in managing the risks for Vanderbilt as we walk through the process that the 5 steps that Jay was describing a few minutes ago. So back to you, Jay, and take us through step 1, please.
Okay. Well, if you think about those nine issues that Steve raised, and imagine your own organization, each one of those issues is dealt with in a different silo inside your company, and you can multiply that by more than the 9 that are on there. And those are the issues. And every day, those issues change for every one of those silos. So when you do your analysis, when you do your risk assessment, each one of those audiences are going to be looking at the same development through their lens. But you can only answer one question for one audience at a time. If you try to answer universally, you really are going to miss the mark. So the first 2 we're going to deal with here is really the heart of the matter. Nothing else is going to happen until you decide exactly who your target audience is and what their desired outcome is. What's the key intelligence question they want to answer? And again, we're talking here in this exercise about how you answer one question for one audience. So first of all, who exactly are Vanderbilt's decision makers? What are their near-term priorities? And what we have to do here, you have to understand what their requirements are. And that's really knowing who your customer is. And again, each one of those silos, they're going to have different interests on different days at the same time. And they're really interested in whether the likelihood of their achieving their desired outcome. And again, we'll get into deciding estimated probabilities when we get there. And it's assessed based on evidence and analysis. Let's go into the question.
Right. So what we're going to do now is, based on the brief description of Vanderbilt that we gave you a moment ago, we're going to put your fingers back to work by asking you to make a selection from these 3 hypothetical key intelligence questions. So we're giving you 3 choices, and we're just going to run the poll, and we'll find out from you in the second of our polls. Let's see to what extent you think we're just going to, there's just a one choice you can make here. So it's either A, B, or C. Make a choice as to which of these 3 you think is the key intelligence question that needs to be answered by the analysis that we're going to perform as we go through steps 2, 3, 4, and 5 of the method. So it might seem that the process of defining the key intelligence question. This might seem somehow that this is sort of pedantic, that this is sort of fussing around a lot of verbiage relating to a very crucial, critical, fast-moving situation. And the reason why that happens is because, generally speaking, going back to the slide I mentioned earlier, right, the default mode for many people in today's fast-moving world is figure out what needs to be done, figure out who's going to do it, what's going to be done, and get it done. And what we're saying here is that that process could be very treacherous to you in situations that have so many moving parts, so many multiple and overlapping and potentially interconnecting risks, and so much uncertainty. So this primary step, though it might seem is like a pause in the 5-step process, is actually the crucial launching point. And that's why we're taking the time to get you to help us figure out what's the best key intelligence question. So I'm going to end the poll to share the results. So it looks like so far we have a highly sophisticated audience here, because we have 84% of you.
What a surprise. What a surprise.
And it's no surprise to Jay and myself, right? This is the kind of response that we get when we ask people with your skills and abilities to address the key intelligence question. What we really want to emphasize is that if it wasn't for asking you to do this, you might have leapfrogged over this point and be busily chasing down any one of those siloed type approaches that Jay mentioned that would lead you into a very narrow, but not necessarily.
It's not just narrow, it's dangerous. Take down the poll. I'm going to look at the questions. If you look at the difference, these really matter. First of all, who's your audience, okay? And what's their key intelligence question? If you look at A and B, that's the data you pick. That's the data you pick. And you're focusing on the data, and you're focusing only on how much money they can make, okay, during the invasion, or how much they're going to lose. And the second one too is, are they better placed than competitors? It's a very different question, and it impacts what you collect, and it impacts how you generate an answer. So if you don't understand who you're writing for, and you don't understand their question, you're going to be led down a rabbit hole that could be potentially dangerous for your company. To the last question is, to what extent opens up the possibilities. If you think about it as a scale of 0 to 100, to what extent will Russia's invasion impact Vanderbilt's ability to meet the okay? That opens up the venue, the vision, to a very wide lens, and allows you to answer the question fully. Okay, so again, the question in the classes I teach, the question takes a long time to figure out, and it's surprising sometimes in my world of analysts how often they really don't think through the question, and they get themselves in a bind. Go ahead and hit the next slide.
All right, so now we're into step two, excuse me. So over to you, Jay, as to how we then apply the assumptions to this desired outcome.
So here we are. Okay, so basically everyone in the room has agreed on that question. That's the question we have to answer. Okay, and so you go through the process and you look at all the evidence. We'll show you how to do that later. And here's your answer. Okay, here's the answer to the question. All right, the desired outcome is Vanderbilt will continue to meet the expectations of its customers, shareholders, employees, in spite of the Ukraine conflict. Okay, so what we're really focusing on here is the will. The assessment is Vanderbilt will be able to do it. Will. And we're going to be focusing on that estimated probability. Is the word will correct? And we start that process by developing a list of working assumptions. Assumptions are conditions that have to persist in order to support the likelihood the desired outcome will occur. Why am I reading it for you? Because assumptions have multiple definitions depending on where you are and what your background is. But for us, it's really what's underneath that will. What are the assumptions that group is making that's underneath the decision to be so highly certain that Vanderbilt can meet their expectations? And so basically then you go around the room and you come up with the 10 or 20 assumptions that have to hold in order to desired outcome. And you go ahead and collect the evidence and sources to support these assumptions. Go ahead and click the next slide. We'll get to the working assumptions.
Right. So I'm not going to go through all of the working assumptions here. What this slide portrays for you all is that, as Jay was saying, when you sit down and remembering this is a diverse group, this is like their worksheet. They're going to list all of the assumptions that support that contention that Vanderbilt will be able to achieve its desired outcome. So what you get is, not surprisingly, from the diverse participants in this discussion, you get assumptions that relate to the various different areas and those different risks that we started talking about at the beginning. So we have assumptions relating to customers, the supply of goods. We also have about the prices, the raw materials, as well as energy, the operating activities in the geographies affected by the conflict. We have issues relating to the company and its stock price, its perception in the markets. We have debts and receivables, investments. We even have the well-being of the employees, the insurance claims, cyber attack, everything that we talked about in the total compendium of those risks at the beginning are featuring in the list of working assumptions, because the group that's been doing this preparation is sufficiently diverse, as Jay explained before, and is collaborating to come up with this very compendious list.
Let me talk about the list for a second. If you notice a couple of characteristics of the assumptions, they're all positive. Okay, will be able. Assumptions are intended to be positively stated because there's 1,000 things that not have to happen. We're focusing here on the assumptions that have to hold in order to support the will. Steve, I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's good. So from step 2, which was to list these working assumptions, we then go to step 3, which is to refine that list into the key assumptions. Over to you, Jay.
So we're going to select the key assumptions. And again, it's not that the other assumptions don't matter. Again, think about this as a flow. You know your audience, okay? You have the question, you've made the judgment, right? So now we're going to test that judgment. We're going to test the estimated probability of your audience reaching their desired state, which is to be able to meet customers' expectations. And so after a lot of discussion, some of it good, some of it not so good, we go ahead and we select the 5 or 6 working assumptions that become what we call the critical assumptions. And again, we're talking about answering this question. And we only select 5 or 6 because if you go beyond that, you're really beyond the limits of your control. If you find yourself unable to stay at 6, it means that the will really isn't going to hold anyway. Go ahead and hit the next one. Okay.
Right. So from that same selection that we saw a couple of minutes ago, the assumptions that are highlighted in red text are the ones that we are representing this hypothetical discussion group, the ones that we all agree are the most crucial to the achieving or not achieving the desired outcome. So what we have is customer orders, we have the supply of the goods coming from the affected geography, we have the price related issues, the price of the goods, material, transportation. This is all extremely relevant to our hypothetical agricultural company. There's operating issues for the plants, their production plants that they have located close to the source of these agricultural commodities. And then lastly, and it might seem somehow distinct from the first, but we'll argue is crucial, is the overall impact of this fast-moving situation on the company's reputation. Basically, the point being is that because of the company's reputation, as many of you will know from other readings, it takes years to build and seconds to destroy. The most crucial element of meeting those expectations and the desired outcome is that the company maintain its reputation in this fast-moving and complicated situation.
Okay. Let me make one more point about assumptions. And I know you're saying, well, how did we get these? Okay, these are not developed out of thin air. Whether you know it or not, when you go into a room and you all have the same data, you're all looking at the same pile of data, you're all looking at it through a different lens. And that lens is based on the assumptions that you're making about the data before you enter the room. And you may not even know you have assumptions. And part of the exercise that we're talking about here is these assumptions are drawn out. They're in your head. And you may not even know it, but you have to go ahead and think about these in terms of what conditions in your head have to hold. Why do you believe it's a will or not a will? Okay, go to the next one.
Yep. So now what Jay's going to do is Jay's going to show you how these 5 key assumptions get analyzed in a methodical manner. And this table might look a little complicated, but Jay will walk you through the mechanics here. And then once he's done that, we'll actually show you how we populate it based on the information that in our hypothetical situation.
What I want to emphasize here is the power of this instrument. Getting the audience right, getting the question right, gathering the data to answer the question, okay? And arraying that data, the answer is in the data. Once you collect that data, you array it in a table, and the answer is there. And what you're doing here is you're testing it. And this is the most critical tool that we exercise in the book that we wrote, because from this, you'll see as we go through this, everything else flows. And it keeps you away from making predictions. We don't make predictions. We forecast the most likely outcome of the audience reaching their desired state. And this is a key assumptions check. It's been used inside the intelligence community for years. And it's a really useful tool. I've seen it work. But what happens here is you bring this in when you get into a log jam and everyone's stuck and they can't seem to get to the answer. And you say, okay, what do we really know here? Right? And what the key assumptions check does is it forces you in to understanding what your assumptions are and looking at the data. So let's just take a real quick look at this. So you see over there in the left-hand column, the assumptions that we've chosen, the key assumptions are arrayed against some criteria along the top. And you'll see at the very top there, you'll see the judgment. Don't forget, it keeps your mind on what you're testing here, which is that Vanderbilt will continue to meet. And so the ratings in column 2 and 3, as you can see over there on the right, are really about the certainty and the reliability of the evidence. What those are is you may have a lot of evidence that points in one direction or another to answer the question, but where is that information coming from? And it's how credible is the sourcing? And again, these are all subject to discussion in the room among the people who are there. And then if you look at the last two, the next column, the third one over, if assumptions fail, this is a really important one because it shows the complexity of the problem you're dealing with. How closely tied are these assumptions to each other? If one fails, does it really matter to the judgment, or is it not really relevant to the judgment? And then over there, the last one is the assumption fails. How much does it impact the desired outcome? Now, again, some people try to average those first three columns and come up with an average answer in the last one. That's just not how it works. Okay, it's a separate discussion of the impact of the assumption and the validity of the assumption on the judgment will. Why do we do it that way? If you have a separate discussion, it may well be that there's an assumption that doesn't really matter much that rates very highly in terms of impact on the judgment. So it's a separate discussion in that last column. And Steve is now going to take you through populating it. Steve, did I miss anything? Off we go.
No, good. But we'll both comment on how we populate it. Right.
Okay.
So just remembering, first of all, what Jay said about the first about columns 2 and 3, right? So in those columns, high numbers, generally speaking, point towards reinforcing the desired outcome, right? So what you have in the second column, hopefully, will be numbers close to or at 10 for how relevant and certain is the evidence, right? So in a situation that's not at all uncertain, you would expect to see 10s in that column. In the third column, how credible is the source of the evidence? What that means is in addition to having very tangible, professionally prepared and understandable evidence, who's it coming from? Is it coming from people whose objectivity and competence has been universally established? Or is it coming from sources that claim a lot of legitimacy, but in fact, maybe are only just attempting to use that information more for promotional or for persuasive purposes? So either way, basically in columns 2 and 3, what you get is an X-ray of the quality of the data. So in any situation where you're trying to defend a judgment which is that something will happen, which is the highest level of certainty, you want to say high numbers in columns 2 and 3. Well, as you can see, there are definitely not some low numbers in columns 2 and 3. Now, this shouldn't surprise anyone because we already, from the get-go, we already entered into this analysis knowing that the situation is fast-moving, it's uncertain, and that it has many direct and indirect consequences. But what we've done here in columns 2 and 3 is that we've highlighted what we believe to be the numbers that potentially communicate a story, which we will then be able to compose into a recommendation that Jay will show you in a few minutes. But these numbers, the ones that we've highlighted, are the ones that have the most, let's say, most impact on the desired outcome, which is that Vanderbilt will be able to maintain it. So in particular, where you can see that the numbers are in the 7s, there's something like a reasonable expectation, but it's far from certain. When the numbers are in even lower, and of course the lowest numbers on our chart here are the 5s, what this really means is that the situation is at this point, there's no way to be able to give a higher level of expectation than 50-50. This is, of course, not only is this crucial to the level of expectations and the planning and all of the operating activities that our company has to undertake, The most important thing is that it's transparent, right? It's based on that discussion that Jay described. There's a reason why each one of those numbers are high or low. So in some senses, what we can say is that a number of 7 in this extremely uncertain situation isn't necessarily what you might call a point of failure. In fact, for our company, with decades of experience and a global reach, perhaps they exclusively, they are better able to be able to manage the uncertainties. When Jay and I have assigned a number in that first couple of columns, we're talking about Vanderbilt, not about the industry as a whole. This is a very, very specific analysis.
So I want to take it a little bit further, and I want to call your attention first to the lower right-hand box there. We talk about linchpin. Linchpin analysis developed inside the intelligence services sometime in the late 90s, early 2000s. And what you're trying to identify here is the one critical assumption that absolutely must hold to support the level of certainty. Take a look at the second row there. Our linchpin is Vanderbilt will be able to find alternative suppliers for the goods that it usually purchases from Russia and Ukraine. I'll tell you a secret. We had to lower these numbers for this exercise in the space of 6 weeks from the last time we did this exercise for a group. The numbers were higher. But what you can see here in each row, as Steve was pointing out, each row is a story, and these numbers are data driven. They're data driven. If you look at the first two, you're talking about everyone in the room is saying how relevant is the evidence and how credible is it. And what you're seeing there in the linchpin is a holy cow moment because the relevant it's really thin data. Okay, the will is supported by really thin data, and we're certain. If you look at the second number, we're really certain at the level of 8 that it's thin data. Okay, and so each line is a story, and what this does is from this you'll see in the next few slides. This tells you the story. This is the story, and the data is in the story. What you're doing is looking for patterns that get you to understand the linchpin, what really matters. And from this, you'll see you go ahead and you can draw out the most critical linchpin, and then go ahead and you can make your risk assessment. But Steve and I can't underscore enough the importance of this outcome. And this can take a long time because, again, you're in a room full of 12 people or 10 people, whatever it is, and you're working with, you're trying to sort out the answer to this question. How certain can we be that Vanderbilt's going to be able to meet their customers' expectations? It's a huge question. And what this table says is, I don't know. Okay. And that becomes the linchpin. Steve, anything else you wanted to add to that before we move on?
Yeah, I wanted to highlight in the fourth column, which is the one about the assumptions impacting each other. In the fourth column, low numbers in that column actually tend to help to a more positive view of the situation, because if the individual assumptions fail, but that the likelihood that they will cascade and cause all the other assumptions to fail is relatively low, what this means is that they are somewhat distinct. In other words, that the whole situation isn't an inverted pyramid balanced on one focal point. And then in the last column, as Jay mentioned, just a reminder that the last column is by no means any kind of aggregation of the numbers in the first 3 columns. The last column basically says of the situations that the assumptions that need to hold in order for the desired outcome to occur, if they don't hold, how much is it going to impact our overall outcome? Then clearly the ones with the 10 are the most important, right? And remembering here that what we did, and this was of course our own expertise in creating the desired outcome, we set the calibration for these assessments on the expectations. So in other words, we're not calibrating whether the company will deliver the goods and so on, because a lot of that is outside their control. What we're really saying is, with this grid, can the company meet its customers' expectations, given the externalities of the Russia-Ukraine situation that are beyond anybody's control? So
Steve raises a really critical point that I should have mentioned as well. What the other thing the table does, as Steve's explained, it's a range of outcomes. We're deciding that today this is the linchpin is we'll be able to find it. But it doesn't mean that the other assumptions aren't important, as Steve pointed out, but not today. Okay. And if you look at the outcome of the table as a range of operating environments, which is sort of how you need to look at it, there's no one answer. Okay, and the thing to keep in mind here, and I'll probably say that we'll say this again at the end, is all this work is going to do is reduce the chances of error, maybe 5 or 10%. But for a company like Vanderbilt, 10% is colossal, colossal. Steve, anything else you wanted to add before we move on?
No, that's good. So we're going to move now into we've given you as brief an explanation of these numbers as time allows. Now we're going to go into how do you convert what these numbers are saying into a message that can be used by your company's leaders to make the right decisions.
So if you take a look at this, okay, if we could string this together, you would say, you go back to the audience. It's audience, question, data collection, arraying the data, testing the assumptions, and again, testing the estimated outcome. And here we are where you're taking those numbers, which are our narrative, and turning it into language that the audience can understand. And if you look at it, you're really trying to sort through the likelihood of desired outcome. And the ratings can improve. Basically, what you're saying here, what you're going to be telling the audience is that, hey, these ratings are risky now, if you look at the linchpin, and that's the one you really have to address, okay? And it may well be that it's really a matter of reaching out and getting more sources, and it's certainly a matter of developing mitigation strategies. Again, to make the point here, note the flow. No step is, the steps are interdependent. They have to be followed in sequence. You can't skip steps. You can't skip steps. If you do, if you start skipping steps, you're going to get weapons of mass destruction, is the example I always use in class. They skip steps. And again, develop mitigation strategies. And if you go on, if we had the time, we'd go ahead and develop indicators that, in fact, the mitigation strategies were working and the numbers were changing. So, for example, the quality of the data that we needed in the linchpin might go up because we developed some new sources. Whatever it is, you're developing new strategies to deal with the assumption to change the most likely outcome. And you have indicators that will help you decide, verify that will mark the progress. And again, the rating should be updated whenever indicators are triggered. The other thing that really matters here, and we're going to talk about it at the end, is that the new data changes the validity of the assumption. If the data underneath the assumption is weak, the assumption is weak. Okay. If new data comes in that strengthens it, that becomes a more important. The assumption increases in strength and validity and impact on the outcome. And you have to pay attention to the new data that comes in, and you have to make adjustments. Sometimes daily in really high pressure instances. Okay, Steve, anything you also wanted to add on this?
No, that's good. So it's time to ask our audience to poll one more time here. So what we're asking you to do is the snapshot on the right shows you the ratings that we assigned and briefly explained to you for the 5 assumptions in our key assumptions check. You've got 5 choices. You have to choose one of the 5. So it's A, B, C, D, or E. So I'm going to start this poll, and in doing so, we're going to find out just simply based on the information that we provided you, and of course this is only a very brief interlude in which you get to be able to use this method. We're going to ask you to select one of these 5 assessments that you think the key assumptions check. Which one of these 5 probabilities do you think is best represented by the ratings that we put in the key assumptions check? So we'll give you about 30 seconds. While you're doing that, Jay, anything you'd like to add?
Just think about it in terms of what story does the data tell you? That's the answer. What's the answer the data tells you? Go ahead and mark your answer.
Yeah. So we'll give you about another 10 seconds. And when you think of the conclusion that you are providing in voting in this particular poll here, what you're thinking is that you already know, just with the brief explanations that we provided, a huge amount of work of gathering the information, assessing, then going through the 4 steps up to this point has been going on. It's all going to converge on one of these 5 probabilities. And so therefore, that's why it might seem on the surface that you could roll the dice, but what we're saying is that is the dangerous way to go. If you short circuit the process, you won't be able to make the judgment you're just making now in the poll with anywhere near the level of analytical depth that you're capable of.
These are the same probabilities that they use inside the intelligence community also. So these were used in my world as well. So go ahead and see what they came out with.
Yeah. Okay. So here are the results.
I love it.
Yeah. So we have by far the largest, 50% of you basically went for probably. And then there's sort of showings in all of the others, but I think amongst our audience, we definitely got the leading vote in the probably category. Jay, was that anything like what you expected?
Yeah, it is, and this talks about something I think Steve's going to raise. We hope we raise it either in the questions or we'll raise it at the end. Is that there's differences here? Okay, probably is you know is consistent with the data as you see it, but other people in the group see it differently. Okay, and this is a factor of how people can start with the same data and come out with different conclusions. Right, and it's not that their conclusions are wrong; it's that they're different. And as you go through this, if you do this around the table, you have to say, well, why, Tom, is it highly unlikely? Or why, Maria, is it highly likely for you? What are you seeing in the data that we're missing? Okay, and you see that the conversation shifts. The conversation shifts from I've been here 25 years, you're too young, you don't know what you're talking about, whatever else goes on inside your meetings, which I'm sure happen, is you say, what's the data tell us? What are you seeing in the data that we're not seeing? And so while probably came out on top 50%, 50% came out with something else. And that needs to be addressed. So we can't ignore it, dissenting views. We have to deal with them. Steve, that's sort of where I am on this.
Yeah,
So go ahead.
all right. So now we're going to tell you how we came out on this. Of course, we had plenty of time to prepare, so it's not a fair comparison. So what we came out with, in fact, was completely convergent with what the 50% of you who represent the majority of today's audience. And in order to be able to explain that to, let's say, the board or the senior risk committee in a company, we would have to explain why that probably, what supports that probably contention. So we recognize from the get-go that the uncertainties are clearly there, right? The supply of goods, preserving the operating capabilities of its own installations, and the reputation, these are definitely uncertain. What existing mitigant allows us to converge then on the probably of the five assessments is the company's decades of experience, industry-leading expertise, the fact that it has an extraordinarily powerful network of connections to producers, to carriers, to governments, every possible stakeholder in its area of competence. They have those connections, and they've had their past experience dealing with crises of all kinds of situations, not necessarily military intervention in a major market, but earthquakes and wars and things like that going on. Our company, in this exclusive example that we're showing you here today, our company deserves the assessment of probably, but we didn't pull that out of a hunch. Essentially, we validate that assessment based on all of the work that went on during steps 1, 2, 3, and 4.
So basically, the other thing to have, Steve and I just had this conversation the other day as we were going through the slides, and I'm going to share what happened. The last time we did this, it was likely. Why? Because the war, we weren't sure how the war was going on, but at that particular moment in time, there wasn't a blockade, we weren't sure what the shortage is going to look like, and there were all sorts of things that made it look like this company had such reach and such power that they're going to be able to solve it. But again, looking at the reporting, and what Steve and I did is we looked at the reporting in the newspaper over the last 6 weeks, and we saw basically we changed the value of the assumptions. The numbers changed. And we changed we revalidated the assumptions based on the reporting we had, and you can see that it rather than likely, it's probably. And what the audience wants is they want to know how to get from probably back to likely. That's the story they want from you. Okay, and as Steve talked about, there's some of the things that they can do. But again, if you stick with likely, because for some reason you just can't move from that, and there are analysts that can't move from it. They're just stuck. They're just stuck where they are, and they don't move. The risk there is tremendous. If you deliver a likely when it ought to be a probably, the damage is potentially really serious. And I would just invite you to go online real quickly and look at the judgment in the Iraqi weapons of mass destruction key judgment. He uses the word will, and we know where that came from. So again, it's really important to pay attention to this and look and think about how you can get from probably to likely. Steve, anything else we need to go, or we're ready to move on?
No. So what we're going to do now is we're going to tie it all up with just some takeaways for you and leave a couple of minutes for questions. Hopefully we'll get some questions in the question pane. The one thing that I just want to emphasize before we close out our little mini exercise with Vanderbilt is We did this once in front of you. You got to contribute. It seems like a large number of you basically interpreted our analysis in a very intelligent, thoughtful way. We might have to do this again tomorrow and the next day and the day after that, because of the dynamic nature of the changes, right? Because of bulk carriers of Ukrainian grain trying to sneak their way out through the Bosphorus and into the ports in Africa, right? All of these continuously evolving situations may prompt the need to revisit the ratings. What we want to emphasize is that the hard work to establish the key intelligence question, the working assumptions, the key assumptions, all of that has been done and it's done. What needs to be then maintained and updated is those ratings, and those ratings help the company then adapt and adjust to the changing situation because of the down payment, because of the investment in that preliminary analysis that we showed you in steps 1 through 3.
A couple of things, Steve, why don't you hit the next slide? A couple of things I want to report here too. You know, if you can close your eyes and imagine what's going on inside the Central Intelligence Agency, other intelligence agencies right now, okay? How many times they're testing these assumptions, how many and how hard the work is as they go through and sort through all the issues that they have to deal with. And I've been in meetings where the argument between probably and likely goes on for a whole day, okay? And it's the tools provide you a path, a structured process to get you from understanding your audience to an assessment that works. And again, one of the things I want to focus on the second tick in particular, you can turn us off in a few minutes and you can use this. This is not something that is beyond your reach. The tools are out there. You can use them. There's an immediate return on investment. And one of the things I tell my classes is that you have a choice. You can use a more deliberate process, or you can just guess. And what do you want to tell the President of the United States tomorrow? What do you want to tell him? Okay. Do you want to tell him a guess, or do you want to tell him how you want to have a decision that's based on a consensus with all the players around the table? And the intelligence analysis gives you that path. The last bullet real quickly is you have to change revalidate those assumptions all the time, and get that question right. Nothing else is going to matter. Trust the process. Don't skip steps. I'm done, Steve. I'm done.
Okay,
done.
Thanks.
Questions?
Jim. So before we get into audience questions, what I want to do is just leave this with you, our audience, as so what have we given you here? Basically, we haven't given you a magic bullet. We haven't given you anything that's not is available in the public domain. All these methods are long since published by the intelligence services. But what you may not have, and you can have, is you can adopt a process, and we've just given you the example that we have invested our own time and effort in. Give you a method to be able to test the kind of decision where the stakes and the level of uncertainty are of catastrophic proportions for your company. So you individually, you may not be in the eye of the storm. But what we're saying is that what you've seen today and the method we've explained to you, this is something which you can take away and you can use when the opportunity occurs, because you never know when you're going to need it.
Let's turn to the questions.
Okay, so I'm looking at the question pane here. I've got several questions have come in. I'm going to pick the first one here, which is about, just to paraphrase the question, how do you deal with resistance from participants who are skeptical of the time spent in and the results of this structured analysis?
Here's my response, okay? You can fix it now, or you can fix it. It's pay me now, it's pay me later, okay? You can take the time to argue about something that comes out badly, okay? Or no decision at all. You can take the time to go through the process. Steve, go ahead, and I know you have a perspective on this as well, but I'm telling you, you can get it right or you can get it wrong. Go ahead.
Well, I think one should welcome skeptics, right? As those of you who are practicing in risk management in our audience, without skepticism, everything just goes straight down the middle, and then if it hits the skids, everyone shakes their head. So you need to have healthy skepticism, and we would never ever dispute that. However, what you can do is you can set the expectations of the group. You can say that we welcome your skepticism, but you still have to play, and that means vocalize your dissent, right? Don't we we would not want in any analysis of the kind that we've shown you today. We don't want people to be sitting in the back row saying nothing, waiting until it's all over, then to come in and try to tear it down. So
one of the things we have inside the agency is called tradecraft cells, and we use facilitators. And that's another way to overcome this, is to have someone running the meeting to keep it on track and to keep people within the framework of the process. And it's pretty effective. We've seen that work as well. So facilitator, welcome other views. Welcome other views, but it is hard. It is hard. Getting that buy-in is hard because this is so disruptive. Can be seen as so disruptive. Steve, what's another question?
Yeah, well, another point I'd like to make is if you think of any large group, and Jay talked about 10 or 12 people each with their own level of expertise, being involved in a situation where essentially they're all of equal standing, but no one person has the answer to the key intelligence question. In any group, no matter how large, and you, our audience today, you be one, right? There is one portion that agrees with the proposition. So some of you think this is great that we're talking about today, hopefully more than just one. There's always going to be a group that thinks that this probably is not very valid, that you have your own reasons and so on. So you generally are skeptical about its value. And there's a third portion, which is undecided.
Yeah.
So with any kind of group where you're attempting to try to achieve this common goal, right, the collaboration that Jay talked about, essentially what you're hoping to do is you're hoping to get those who are opposed to open their minds to the possibility that this is a valuable process, and those who are undecided to work through the process, and in doing so to reach a conclusion that this process can really help in situations of the unique.
Let's see if we get to another. Let's see if we get to a couple more questions, Steve, real quickly.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we've got time for one more question here. Let me look down the list. So this question is about how do you actually do this? It says, are there any key requirements for incorporating this kind of structured analysis into a company's decision-making process?
Yeah. This is really a good question. Real quickly, we don't care how you get to the answer. We can't possibly change how companies have been making decisions for decades, okay? That's their business. All we want you to do is test the answer. All we did today was test the judgment. We tested the level of probability. That's it. We really can't integrate it in the sense of changing how you do it. You can change how you test the judgment before you hit the send button. And that's how Steve and I pitch it in the book as well. We can't change how you do it. How you make the sausage, we can test the sausage before you hit the send button. Steve, real quickly, anything you want to add?
Yeah, so one thing that I think will be familiar to all of you that are working in large organizations, especially in risk, which often has to fight for a stake in any kind of discussion, is one of the key enablers of using this kind of method when it's needed in an organization is to have executive buy-in. In other words, the senior executives perhaps need to feel the heat of these kinds of situations and perhaps their own anxieties about not having the precise data, everything that they want to be able to make a really clear and concise decision. So with the support of executive leaders in your company, this kind of process can be implemented in a coherent manner. The second thing, and this is something that Jay and I have experienced in practical terms, is a 45-minute webcast doesn't make you an expert. There's an element of training and practice involved in this kind of work, and a small group can acquire the skills to be able to do this work anytime in any situation. But you have to get that core capability built in. And then just Jay, the last thing is, in order for you to be able to create a fertile environment in a company, you have to run a pilot. So take a live or a past situation, apply the method, show yourselves in a real situation in your company, show how it works. Then you can form your conclusion. Can we use this method or some similar method? If you've got those three ingredients, then you can achieve the implementation. And I think my final takeaway is, if this is valuable and that decision is up to you, you can't just pull it off the shelf. It needs to be in place when you need it, because when you do need it, if it's not there, then you're not going to have the ability to make.
Just to build on one of Steve's points really, really quickly, analysts get 18 weeks of training before they ever get to a desk, and it's lifelong learning at the agency. So 45 minutes just doesn't do it. They go on and they still make mistakes. They still skip steps. and mistakes happen. Intelligence failures are failures of process. They skip steps. I think that, do we have any more time, Steve? We're out of time.
I think we're right up on the top of the hour here. So what I would like to say is if any of you have any follow-up questions, and I'm sorry we couldn't answer all the ones from the Q&A, you know how to find us. We would be very happy to answer questions. Nothing would please us more to help those of you that feel strongly about using these methods to help your companies. If you succeed, then that for us validates the time and effort that we put into this.
I have seen this change how analysts think in my first day of training. I've seen the impact of this process on how they do their work. I'm done.
Yep, absolutely. Well, on behalf of Columbia University and the School of Professional Studies, Jay and I would like to say thank you so much for the opportunity to share our knowledge with you. Hopefully what you've heard today will be helpful to you in your present and future work. And it's really been a pleasure to be able to spend this last hour with you.